Okay, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Josh Steinfeld from Carta. I lead product strategy for Carta Total Compensation, which is Carta's compensation benchmarking and communications tool. Very excited for today's discussion. We are right in the thick of compensation season today. So we have a great people leader with us to kind of talk through how to think about compensation and what to think about as we're going through the cycle and how to sort of stay on top of things when it comes to your compensation strategy. So I'd love to welcome Darcy Mackay to the stage. Hey, Darcy, how are you?
Hey, Josh. Great. How are you?
Great. Darcy's from Rippling. Darcy, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody?
Yeah, well, it's great to be here. And I love that opening video as someone who has workplace in my responsibilities, in addition to kind of all things HR and compensation. That was really cool. So I'm Darcy Mackay. I essentially am Rippling's Chief People and Places Officer and oversee a bunch of things, as I mentioned, including compensation and recruiting, people operations, the HRBP world, in addition to a fun real estate and workplace team.
And I would love to be introduced by that video every single day when I walk in the office.
Yeah.
Well, great. So let's get into it. So Rippling, I think, as everyone knows, is just a fantastic growth story. So thinking about going through that period of growth, how did you think about evolving your people strategy and kind of more specifically your compensation philosophy over that time?
Yeah. So yes, we have had a pretty cool growth trajectory over the last 8 years or so. For those of you who are not familiar with Rippling, we've got about 20,000 customers. We run about 45 billion in annual payroll volumes. We have more than 20 different products across HR, IT, and spend, including compensation. Internally, we like to say we dog food our own products, but we are kind of our first customer. We've got about 3,800 employees at the moment. And typically our year-over-year employee growth rate is about 40 to 50%. And so this idea of sort of how you scale compensation is definitely top of mind in a high growth environment here. Given that the new GDP report was just issued this morning, I think it's also, and obviously the economy has been in the news a lot with the upcoming U.S. election, to reflect on the economic backdrop that we're in at the moment. And we've seen this incredibly tight labor market for the most part ever since we were in COVID, where employees have generally had the upper hand in terms of negotiating compensation with a scarce labor market. And I think the GDP report that came out this morning shows that continual, annual growth rate. I think we landed at about 2.8% annualized growth in Q3. So we've kind of seen the softening of a few roles in the tech market with some of the layoffs in FANG. And then I think Visa made an announcement yesterday. But we're still in this really robust economy. And I think one of the stats I saw recently was that wages are outpacing, wage growth outpaced inflation for the first time in August. So the question is how do you design a comp strategy to attract and retain the best talent against that backdrop? And at Rippling, we're a pretty late stage startup. We're well capitalized, but we have to be really, really careful about where we spend those dollars. How much of it is going into employment versus other non-employment costs like real estate, right? Like workplace, which motivate employees. And then within employment, how do we allocate capital to, for example, R&D roles versus sales roles, et cetera. So our compensation philosophy has to be grounded in that backdrop, but survivable across multiple cycle types and shifts in our economy. And so we've had a comp philosophy that I'll tell you the parts that haven't changed. We've always had principles of competitive pay. versus the market, making sure we're paying competitively. We have principles around fair pay, especially when it comes to looking at internal employees and how they're paid versus other similarly situated employees. We have had a long-standing premise that our employees should benefit from Rippling's long-term success, particularly around equity. But the thing that has changed more recently is that we are increasingly emphasizing our pay for performance philosophy.
Yep.
And while we've had that for a little while, I don't know that we have activated that quite as much as we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are in the process of shifting the way we do compensation. And I'll give you just a couple of quick examples. I'm happy to double click on them, but we've added some variable comp models in spots around the world with very specific job families that reflect kind of where we are in the market and in our stage of company. We have also started to look at varying merit increases in line with performance. And then we launched recently a new equity model, both in terms of new hire grants as well as how we do refreshes that help us really activate a pay for performance philosophy. And we're able to do that, I think, pretty confidently because we have a robust performance management system, both in terms of our process as well as how we do that in product through calibration. So we're able to help, ground that pay for performance in what we think is a pretty strong rating scheme.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear more about sort of like the importance of the performance management piece and sort of like how you thought about that alongside any kind of compensation changes that you were thinking about making.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to differentiate pay on performance if you're not confident in your performance management system and that it is calibrating people fairly across the organization. And what I mean by that is when you look at how most performance management has historically been done, it's really at the whim of the manager, right?
Mm.
How is the manager viewing that employee's performance? And that creates a lot of variation. And
Yep.
so unless you have some really strong standards that start with, calibrated job descriptions and people's roles and their quarterly goals or annual goals or OKRs or whatever you use, and you have a process to then, rate people and have open discussions around how someone is performing, you don't get, equitable and fair outcomes. We recently launched Talent Signal in the market. I don't know if you heard about that, but it is an AI-driven talent assessment tool that gives managers a signal on their new employees, specifically at the 90-day mark. And we're in early testing with it. We've got a number of customers in our early access program, and we're running this on our own engineers. And what we're trying to do is take not that performance management is only AI driven. It's not. It's got a human component, but we're trying to check human bias with more robust systems and processes to help us evaluate people fairly.
Yeah. So interesting. Well, this wouldn't be like a tech company webinar without talking about AI a bit. I think we'll touch on it a bit later. But I saw I saw a stat earlier this morning that just showed like an overwhelming percentage of organizations are looking at least looking at AI for their HR processes, and I think like performance management is kind of one of those spaces where I think there's a really great opportunity to help people, not necessarily replace people. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely +1 on the support people. And what our research has found, because we've been studying this pretty closely, is exactly along the lines of your findings. And most of the C-suite, I think it was like 88%, if I'm recalling correctly, in our recent survey, this was specific to the United States, said that 88% of the C-suite expects HR to be using AI. But most people report that they're really not using it very strategically. They're using it quite tactically, meaning like creating a draft of a job description, or maybe an interactive chatbot, but it's not
Yeah.
gone too much further than that.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely early days. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out.